Hi, this is a presentation on narrative form for FA 101, Introduction to Film. Just as a note before we move on, as you work your way through, or as I work my way through this presentation, with this audio, you should also have the Prezi up and available. There are points where I'll ask you to stop, and in the Prezi there are links to YouTube videos that help illustrate terms and concepts of narrative form. So at certain points I'll just say go ahead and pause this video and go to the Prezi and watch the YouTube link to help illustrate whatever we've just talked about. We'll also go over these in class when we meet on day 2 just to supplement this. Just as a note though, whenever I say pause, go ahead and pause this video, go back to the Prezi in Blackboard, make sure and open it up, find the right YouTube link, and just take a look at the clip that's residing at that link. Alright, so narrative defined, and then this is just, again, it's not that you don't know what a narrative is, not that you don't know what a story is, because you do. You're all story receivers, you've been consuming stories, audiovisual narratives, and literary narratives probably most of your life in some format, so you already know how a story works. What we're doing is establishing common terminology we can use to talk about the parts of a story and how they function together to create a whole. So for our purposes, a narrative is an account of a string of events occurring in space and time. It's that simple. Just a sequence of events that happen over a period of time at a certain location or several certain locations and in some way tell a story. And usually these are ordered by the logic of cause and effect. That is, we see a character doing something, something happens to him or her, this effects some type of change or propulsion in the narrative that builds suspense in some way, right? And usually that's typically how narratives carry forward, right? So these are just our basic definitions of a narrative. Now, narrative films, and the narrative films that we're going to focus on, usually focus on human characters and their struggles. Like, that's why we watch movies. We want to watch other human beings basically enduring issues in their life, struggling through things. That, for whatever that says about us as a culture, that's what we like to consume in our audiovisual narratives. So what we're usually watching when we watch narrative films is we're watching stories about characters who are pursuing goals and they're encountering obstacles along the way that are getting in the way of those goals. And then we basically want to see what they do to overcome those goals and achieve whatever they're trying to achieve, whatever that might be. So again, these are the types of films that we're going to watch. And we'll articulate this in more specific detail when we actually have a film in front of us where we can apply these terms. But these are just the basic terms and concepts to consider when we're defining narrative in general, and then narrative films and what we're going to focus on. So some narrative terminology that's specific to film narratives: diegetic and non-diegetic. Right? So anything that's part of the diegesis can be detected by the people in the film. Right? So it's diegetic. So a character walks up to a turntable, puts a record on, puts the needle down on the record, and then music comes out of the speakers. That is part of the diegesis, right? Or anything else that he or she can sense with the 5 senses is part of the diegesis. So anything that's non-diegetic or not part of the diegesis is something that's just for you. And the most concrete example of this is score. So unlike the character who walks up and puts the needle on the record and then the music starts to play so that he or she can hear that music, if there's overlaying score, right, just the score, the background music, right, that's meant to sort of manipulate you emotionally relative to what's going on the screen, that's not part of the diegesis. So most of the score of a film, unless you know the characters can hear it, right, that is, they walk by and somebody's playing the guitar on the street, that's part of the diegesis. But if there's a dramatic moment in a film and then you get dramatic music accompanying that, you can assume that those characters can't hear that music, right? That's just for you to basically build on the dramatic tension in the scene. So it's not part of the diegesis. Yeah. And if you take this idea down here, anything that a film character cannot detect with the 5 senses is non-diegetic. In other words, it's meant for the film viewer and the film viewer alone. Go ahead and pause at this point in the film and watch the beginning of Reservoir Dogs here, and this is a clip that you'll find within the Prezi. And what you're seeing is a type of score happening in the film at the very beginning, right? That's meant just for you, not for them, and it's meant to create a certain atmosphere and a certain impression of the characters. Right? Again, we'll talk about this more in class when we meet on day 2, but go ahead and watch this as an example and see if you can identify diegetic, non-diegetic elements. So some more narrative terminology specific to film narratives. These two concepts, fabula and séauché, right? And another way of saying fabula is just saying the story, and that is the complete chronological story. The séauché, which is the actual plot, is the abbreviated, reorganized events as they appear on the screen. So, and here's one way to think about this. If you think about your life in its entirety right now, from start to finish, right, there's a complete chronology to that life, right? All the exciting stuff and all the boring stuff mixed in together, right? But if you told the story of your life, you would basically you wouldn't tell every little detail from start to finish. That is, you wouldn't tell a complete chronological story. You would abbreviate it. You would organize the events in such a way where they'd be captivating to your audience. So basically, you would construct a plot of your life. This is the same thing that filmmakers do. And this will just help us talk about the difference between fabula and séauché in any particular film, because usually what happens in a film is there's lots of background information that's either hinted at or just left completely unspoken, that in our heads we put together to help us basically understand characters better and understand events together. That's us basically imagining aspects of the fabula, right, to help us basically make sense of what we see in the plot. Right? Because the director can't possibly bring in every little element. Some things have to be left up to inference. Some people have to be left up to the logic on the part of the viewer to basically put things together, because you're working with usually about a 90-minute time period for a narrative film, like a full-length feature film. So there's a difference between the fabula and the séauché. The fabula is a complete chronological story. The séauché is what the director actually pulls down that he or she thinks would be captivating, and then they're arranged in a certain way, whether that's in chronological order or through flashbacks or a combination thereof, to create a narrative structure that is actually captivating to the audience. Okay? So narrative structure, this third piece of terminology down here, are the choices made in putting together a plot to help the viewer organize the flow of information and determine critical turning points. So how the séauché is ordered basically helps you read the story and understand the nature of the cause and effect sequencing that's happening, so you build understanding about what's going on in the film, even when complete understanding can't possibly be there. Right? So no matter how much you're aware of it, we're usually putting together little gaps when we watch audiovisual narratives that help us basically make sense of the overall whole, that help us make sense of character motivation and character background, things like that. All right, conventional narrative structure, right, usually follows a basic pattern. And this goes all the way back to literal stage plays, right? So this 3-act structure is based on a 3-act play, which was very conventional and still is very conventional. So the 3-act structure looks something like this. The first act is basically the introductory aspect of the film, the setup of the film. Okay? The second act is where basically action rises, the tension rises, right? The stakes get higher relative to whatever goals are being pursued by the characters and whatever obstacles are getting in the way of achieving those goals. And the third act usually starts with some type of climax, like the point of greatest tension, the hardest goal to achieve, the largest obstacles overcome. And usually after that you get some type of resolution, so you get some falling action like you see right here, which is where usually things are tied up, right? So we understand what happens to the characters, where they're headed, loose ends are tied up, right? This is called resolution, right? So again, Act 1 is the introduction or the setup. Act 2, you get rising action and stakes rise. And this is usually where this confrontation between protagonist and antagonist. That third act usually begins with the climax, where you get resolution of some sort after the greatest moment of tension is resolved. You get that falling action and some type of resolution. Right? That's the most typical structure. Some films will break into a 4-act structure, and these are usually films with a twist. So this is exactly the same. I've just added a different element here. Usually there's a fourth act is created right here in the middle of what would normally be the second act. There's a major turning point or a twist. That's sort of where everything is changed relative to expectations. And so you get sort of a 4-act structure. So you get some more, as a story sort of realigns itself on its new focus, right, in this newly sort of situated third act, this continues the sort of the rising of the stakes of the film until you get to a climax and falling action in the fourth act. Okay. We'll come back to these two elements in class, just because we're going to talk about sort of a more complicated type of plot structure that's meant to sort of use the conventional 3 and 4 act structure as a base, but we're going to add more terminology to it and talk about that terminology as a way of talking about how story is structured. this image over here is basically the graph you were just looking at, and what's been applied to it is Dazed and Confused, the plot structure of that film, which you guys aren't going to watch this term, so we'll apply it to a different film. But when you see these sections here, this is just an example from a different film, in this case, Dazed and Confused. All right, so we'll also talk about variations on narrative convention. And so, again, that 3-act structure and even the 4-act structure and our basic definition of narrative, and the basic expectations of viewing audiences that we talked about in the film analysis and a little bit of history presentation, all of those things, filmmakers basically play around with those aspects, right? So this expectation that we have for clarity, unity, understanding character motivation, plot closure that sort of gives us resolution and ties up loose ends, those are all basic expectations that anybody playing around with narrative structure can toy with, can tweak. Like, they can resist the urge to offer you clarity at certain points as a way of building mystery, or they can create a plot that's not completely unified in terms of how it's sequenced because it's meant to be confusing in some way, usually for a purpose. They can blur character motivation. Like, maybe you're not quite sure why a character's doing what he or she is doing, right? Again, to build tension, to build mystery around the nature of the character. And that 3rd act or that 4th act, depending on which structure you're talking about, which usually gives us plot closure and resolution, not all films give us that. They don't always tie up all the loose ends. And we'll talk about some examples in class as well. These are basic expectations that when somebody wants to build a truly compelling plot, they'll usually play around with our expectations for these 4 elements as a way of creating a plot that's more innovative and more engaging. So some different elements, different techniques that films use to build narrative suspense, right? And also to give us access to subjectivity are restricted narration and point of view shots. Films different than other types of story mediums because film usually leaves you on the outside looking in at characters, so you don't really get in their head. The main way to build that, and that's another way of saying you can't get into their subjectivity as easily as other narratives where the author of a book can simply pull back and tell you what a character is thinking, or literally speaking, a novel can be told in the first person where you're always aware of what's motivating the character and what he or she is thinking. Film doesn't always have that option. There are some techniques that can be used to fill in that subjective gap, but not all films use them. So what film does use primarily as a way of giving you access to subjectivity is dialogue. Right? So you hear what the characters are saying to better understand what's going on inside of them. But of course that can be dangerous in and of itself. So usually a couple of terms that are used to sort of give us access to subjectivity are restricted narration and point of view shots. And some of this involves some type of inference on our part. Restricted narration is anytime a director provides the viewer with selected moment of omniscience. And what I mean by that is if there's a moment in the film where you have a protagonist, a character that you care about and you've been following in his or her in quest to achieve goals and overcome obstacles, and you're following that character, if there's moments in the film where you're given information like that character is not given, right? So you're privy to something that he or she doesn't know. That, a lot of the times, that's called restricted narration, and it can build suspense, right? That is, you know that at the end of a long road, something bad is waiting for your character, but he or she is heading down that road and doesn't know about it, but the filmmaker shows it to you, right? That's one way of restricting narration. That is, the main character is restricted from information, and it's given to you as a way of building suspense. And so if you'll pause right at this point and watch this clip from No Country for Old Men, this is an example of how the antagonist, the villain, right, you're given information about what he's doing that the protagonist doesn't have, right? And it makes you concerned for the protagonist, right? That is, if you care about the protagonist at that point in the film, if it's done a good enough job to build your connection with the protagonist character. So go ahead and watch this YouTube video, pause this video, or this YouTube clip, and pause this presentation video. But again, we'll talk about this in class too. We'll come back to this clip just to make sure and clarify any ideas or questions you guys have about it. Now, point of view shots are a more direct way into actual subjectivity of the character. And so anytime there's a shot where you temporarily share the visual perspective of a character or a group of characters, it's a point of view shot. So sometimes these shots can strengthen your connection to the character, but it's not a rule that always happens. Sometimes point of view shots can be used just to give you information or give you a vantage point that you didn't have previously. It can be used to build suspense. If you think about point of view shots In the horror film, where the point of view shot's a convention used to basically terrify you, in many cases you'll have a point of view shot where you're looking at a potential victim, maybe even the protagonist, from the perspective of the villain in the horror film, right? So if you think of a series like Friday the 13th or any other series, there's plenty of point of view shots where you get to look at the person you care about, and you know that the vantage point that you have when you're looking at that character is one of somebody who wants to do that character harm in some way, and that usually builds suspense. Other points of view shots will actually there'll be a scene where you see the character, right? You're on the outside looking in, and then all of a sudden there's a cut and you're looking at the world through that character's eyes. That's another type of point of view shot where you do get into their perspective to a certain degree. You don't hear their thoughts, right? But you get to see the world for a moment from their vantage point before the film pulls back out and shows you them from the outside looking in again. Right? Again, we'll talk about this more in class. A couple of other techniques for providing viewers with access to character subjectivity is the voiceover, right, and the direct address. The voiceover is simply when you have a scene and you have a voice narration that comes over that basically is telling you what the character is literally thinking at that point. So if you pause the video or this presentation at this point and watch this clip, this is from Band of Brothers, the end of, I think, the second episode, there's a point where there's a reflective moment at the end of this episode where you get sort of access to Captain Winter's internal thoughts, and it's through a voiceover. The direct address is a little different, and you'll notice that you're going to watch this video as well. It's called obtrusive craftsmanship. So you'll notice that John Turturro's character, and this is from Do the Right Thing, is looking directly at you, right? Which doesn't happen very often in film. It breaks the fourth wall. So he's looking directly at you. So he's actually addressing you with whatever he's getting ready to say. Okay. So go ahead and watch this scene, and we'll talk more a little bit. We'll talk more about the direct address and the impact that it has on the viewing experience during class on day 2. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about narrative form prior to us meeting on day 2, go ahead and zap me an email. Thanks for listening. Bye.